what we have to do is to say those choices are inadequate. And we have to return to the kind of serious policy discussions that characterized, for example, after World War II, when Atchison and Marshall and Truman sat down and said, what are our options given a threat that, by all accounts, I think historically, one would argue, was far more dangerous than the threats that we face now from terrorism. I mean, we had nuclear bombs pointed at every major city in the United States. And yet we were able to negotiate that because there was not only among policymakers a sense of seriousness and honesty about the nature of the threat, how we're going to approach it, and so forth. But also among the population, at least in the early years. I write about in the book that the Marshall Plan involved an enormous PR campaign to explain to people why it made sense for us to invest in Europe and why it made sense for us to build the kinds of alliances that ultimately shaped NATO and allowed us to lock in Japan as a long-term ally in Asia. That kind of conversation, I think, is one that it can't just be left to the wise men in Washington, but has to be something that the population as a whole is engaged in.
Now the book, and I have to say, it really is a terrific book. Usually if I'm doing interviews...
He's got to say that.
No, usually you kind of go out of your way not to look like you're trying to promote the book, but this really is an excellent book. And you've titled it The Audacity of Hope. But, you know, we're in a pretty tough environment right now. We've got this war that we just talked about, which is going badly. You mentioned the stock market. Well, the Dow is at record highs, but a lot of working people are feeling economically insecure. The poor have been literally left behind. And Americans are worried about things like terror and the spread of nuclear weapons. We've got tragic situations like Darfur. A lot of people are really depressed. You seem very optimistic. You've titled your book, The Audacity of Hope. Tell us why we should be hopeful. Make the case for hope.
Well, first of all, where I got the title from, some of you remember I actually used the line in the speech that I gave here in Boston. But I actually pilfered it from my pastor. I'm making this confession publicly. He gave a sermon. My pastor's name is Jeremiah Wright. He's the pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ on the south side of Chicago. And he gave a sermon about 18 years ago. I was a young community organizer. And the south side of Chicago, this particular region, this is the far south side of Chicago, had been devastated because steel plants had shut down. This is right when the Rust Belt era was rolling through the Midwest. And there had been massive layoffs and the communities had been devastated. People were out of work. There was a lot of racial conflict and racial turnover in the area. Crime was on the increase. Usual maladies facing inner city schools. And he delivers this sermon that had a very simple premise. He said, you know, it's actually sometimes easier to be cynical. It's easier to feel hopeless. It doesn't require much from each of us. What's audacious, what requires risk, is to be hopeful, to believe that despite what we see around us, what is, there's this other thing that's possible, what could be. And that idea stuck with me, and I think characterized what not only I've ended up finding most valuable in my faith, but also I think described an aspect of the American character that's pretty fundamental. I mean, there's a reason why in that speech I talked about slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs, or immigrants coming from distant shores, not really knowing what it was that they were going to find when they arrived in America, but believing somehow that across that ocean there's something else. And as rough as our history has been, somehow we've continued to have that stubborn optimism that things can be better, and as a consequence of that, the trajectory of this nation, I think, has been in favor of justice and freedom and equity. As bad as things are now, they were worse at many times in our history. Certainly worse for people who look like you and me, worse for the women in this audience, worse for poor people before there was any safety net. And in each juncture, there were a bunch of people who decided, you know what, it's possible for us to come together and solve these problems. And so the basic theme of the book is that most of the challenges we face, healthcare, education, the problems we face in terms of globalization, the foreign policy dilemmas as a consequence of rogue states and nuclear proliferation and terrorism, none of these problems are easy. All of them, though, are amenable to good decision-making, common sense, practicality, and improvement. And if we can focus our politics around what our common values are and our common ideals are, then it's possible for us to make progress, although progress will always be imperfect.
Now, one of the things you stress in the book, it's a theme throughout, is what you feel is the need to reach out to people who hold opposing views to your own, to try and understand what the other side is talking about, even if you don't agree with it, to reach across the aisle, Democrats, Republicans, etc. But that's not what I want to ask you about right now. I want you to put your partisan hat on. Okay. And we're very close to the election. And why is it, looking from the perspective of the American people, your constituents, why is it important, in your view, for Democrats to do well in the upcoming election?
Well, I actually do talk about this in the book, and by the way, I confess in the book that although this book is not balanced, I'm a Democrat. and you know, so some people are going to read it and they say, well, that's not entirely fair, and he mischaracterizes this or that. You know, I strive to be fair, but I still have a perspective. And what I believe has happened over the last 6, 8, 10 years is that the Republican Party has become captive. Now keep in mind, I come from the land of Lincoln, so I don't think that any political party in our history has had a monopoly on wisdom or truth. But over the last 10 years, at least, what you've seen is the Republican Party has become captive to a narrow band of highly ideological absolutists, folks who see problems through preconceived notions about how the world should work as opposed to how it actually does work. And so in the economy, we've had the victory of a radical laissez-faire that has resulted essentially in the working people you discussed earlier being entirely on their own. And each and every decision that's made, whether it's privatizing Social Security or setting up private health savings accounts or diminishing regulation or essentially eliminating antitrust or not enforcing civil rights laws. In each instance, the basic premise is, you know what, anything goes. And folks will sort it out in some fashion, but the government does not have a role to play in the economy, and that's defined in a very absolute way. With respect to foreign policy,